I want to figure out what the best fire-type Pokemon of all time is. The problem is that it's not an easy question. Fire has been consistently at the top of the game for over a decade, in part because Game Freak's Golden Child keeps getting new forms. But I'm feeling up for the challenge, so I'm going to break down what the best fire-type Pokemon of all time is. Fire types have been so strong for so many years, in part because of how the type was designed. A type's weaknesses and resistances will typically give you an idea of how Pokemon of that type want to be used. Steel types, for example, are usually designed with defense as the main focus, thanks to Steel's multitude of resistances and overall lacking offensive spread. For a steel type Pokemon to be strong, it's typically going to need to be defensively oriented in order to best utilize its typing. Other types, such as Ice, are designed with offense in mind. Ice is able to hit several other types for super effective damage, but the only type that Ice resists is Ice, and it has a number of weaknesses to common types to boot. This is why the best Ice type Pokemon tend to be more offensive in nature, making use of the type's offensive relationships rather than trying to fight the losing battle of staying alive. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, a Pokemon's type will determine whether it wants to be offensive or defensive. What makes Fire so interesting and so strong is its well-balanced mix of offense and defense. Defensively, it only has 3 weaknesses, making it a difficult type to remove, and the 6 resistances it provides gives Fire-type Pokemon a lot of staying power. Offensively, it's equally valuable. Only 4 types resist Fire, while 4 are weak to it, and 10 take neutral damage. Thanks to these relationships, the best fire-type Pokemon aren't all forced to choose between defense or offense. They can just be whichever they're best suited for without their typing holding them back. So today we're talking about great fire-type Pokemon, but before we continue, I want to talk about some great watches. Holzkern is the sponsor of today's video, and their watches and jewelry are a personal favorite of mine. I've worn a Holzkern watch nearly every day of the past year, and I don't have any plans on stopping anytime soon. Holzkern products use natural materials such as wood or stone, making every single individual piece unique. I've gotten Holzkern watches for several of my loved ones personally, and everyone's been really impressed. I'm not really a jewelry guy in general, but I do find myself wearing my Holzkern pieces more than I would expect. Holzkern is currently having a Black Friday sale with a buy one, get one 50% off promotion. Whether you're looking to buff up your own collection or you're looking to get gifts for loved ones, this is a great opportunity. This promotion is only going on for a limited time though, so if you're interested, I wouldn't delay. Thanks again to Holzkern for sponsoring the video, and I definitely recommend you check out their website. There are 3 fire-type Pokemon that, in my opinion, are in contention for the greatest fire type of all time. But before we talk about them, let's talk about some fire types that, although not number 1, are still great nonetheless. Starting with Arcanine. Arcanine has been a staple of competitive play in lots of formats where the power level isn't through the roof. It functions as a defensive fire type. Its Intimidate ability supports its team by lowering its opponent's attack, and it can use its incredibly deep move pool to help its teammates out in a bunch of different ways. Will-O-Wisp for burn support, Helping Hand for damage amplification, extreme speed to finish off low HP foes. Even Howl saw some usage this season to boost both its own attack and its partners. One major advantage of using Arcanine is that despite being a support Pokemon, it's still capable of doing damage. Flare Blitz is an amazing fire type attack, and because it's so strong, it allows Arcanine to be a threat even if it isn't especially trained in offense. Arcanine has really well balanced stats, so you need to be careful even around a bulkier Arcanine. And if you decide to slap something like a Choice Band on it, you'll be able to do some serious damage. It's a Pokemon that really epitomizes the balance of the fire type. Not that you need to be well balanced to be good. Torkoal is a Pokemon that's really geared towards offense, but it works because, oh boy, is it strong. Ever since Torkoal was given the Drought ability, it's been a menace. Not only can it set up the strong Sunlight, which boosts all fire moves damage by a huge 50%, but it also gets access to arguably the best fire move of all time, Eruption. Torkoal's further helped out by its abysmal speed stat, which lets it function really well inside of Trick Room. We have in multiple generations seen teams that feature Torkoal as the star win tournaments, and I think that's beautiful. Now, some players have found success with it as a defensive Pokemon, especially when Dynamax was a thing. Torkoal's huge natural defense stat, plus access to disruptive moves, Yawn, and Burning Jealousy, made it a nightmare for physical Dynamax attackers. and it does get some useful supporting moves like Helping Hand. All in all though, Torkoal's definitely best when Eruption is ending the game in 2 turns. On the other side of the coin, Heatran is one of the best defensive fire type Pokemon ever. Heatran has been consistently strong for over a decade now, in large part because it's the only fire and steel type Pokemon ever designed. Combining fire's good defensive spread with steel's phenomenal one creates a Pokemon that is really hard to hit. And with Heatran's good natural offensive stats and coverage moves, easily puts it into contention for the best fire type of all time. Heatran only has 3 weaknesses, to fighting and water and a quadruple weakness to ground. In Scarlet and Violet, players make Heatran even harder to hit by using defensive Terra types of Grass and Fairy, nullifying its prior weaknesses. In past generations, Heatran was equally as menacing. In generations 4 and 5, Steel still resisted Ghost and Dark, making taking Heatran out even more of a pain than it currently is. Heatran's survivability is only made better by its meaningful offensive presence. While it's rarely taking one-hit KOs, its ability to sit in the field and whittle you down with Heat Wave or Earth Power makes ignoring it super costly. In terms of well-balanced, defense-oriented fire types, Heatran is probably number 1. I was on the fence about putting Talonflame on this list. Its stats are really bad, and it feels a little weird next to a Pokemon like Heatran. But we're trying to find the best fire-type Pokemon of all time here, and although Talonflame is good now, when it released, it was a menace. Talonflame's first format was 2014, during X and Y's release. It was immediately obvious that it was going to be a problem. Its new ability Gale Wings gave all of its flying type moves priority, and with Tailwind and Gravebird, this was a big deal. There were almost no good Intimidate users, and flying resistances were limited. People would slap Choice Band on a Talonflame and literally just use it as a win button. Gravebird would always move first, and it felt nearly impossible to switch into. 2 years later, Talonflame again saw play on arguably the most dominant team composition of all time. It was called Big Six and consisted of Xerneas, Groudon, Talonflame, Smeargle, Mega Kangaskhan, and Mega Salamence. Up until the World Championships, this team, or some variant of it, would win almost every single tournament for the entire season. While future iterations of this team would sometimes drop Talonflame, its access to a priority Tailwind enabled the heavy hitters to overwhelm unprepared foes. In Generation 7, Gale Wings received a major nerf thanks to how much Talonflame had caused. It now only works when Talonflame is at full HP, meaning the Brave Bird spam that caused so many people so much pain is no longer possible. Despite that, Talonflame still has a niche. When prankster Pokemon like Tornadus and Whimsicott are around, its ability to set priority Tailwind isn't worth its much worse stats and typing, but for most of the last year, Talonflame's only prankster Tailwind competition was Murkrow. This led to it winning tournaments despite its mediocre stats, so I think it still deserves a place on this list. Let's talk about a Pokemon where there's no question whether or not it deserves to be here. Mega Charizard Y. When Megas were first introduced, it quickly became apparent that not all of them were created equal. I remember trying out Mega Beedrill and nearly getting one-shot by Mega Kangaskhan Fakeout and realizing that Nintendo definitely has favorites. Mega Evolutions, while beloved by casual fans, were kind of a tough pill to swallow for hardcore competitive players, because when they were introduced, there was a clear, major power imbalance. Mega Kangaskhan, Mega Mawile, and Mega Charizard Y were clearly the best by a long shot. Using any other Mega meant sacrificing a lot of the raw power that you would otherwise have. Now, this video isn't about Mega Evolutions, so we really don't need to get into that whole can of worms, but basically, the point is, Mega Charizard Y was so good, it was considered one of 3 viable Mega Evolutions. And there's a good reason for that. Charizard Y was given the Drought ability, allowing it to set up the sun. Just like with Torkoal, this is a massive deal. And while Charizard doesn't learn Eruption, its much higher base speed allows it to be a much more flexible Pokemon than Torkoal. Charizard's ability only activating when it Mega Evolves is another reason for its strength. If Charizard's on the field in its base form, you can't switch in Pelipper or Politoed or Tyranitar if you want to turn off the weather. Because switches happen prior to Mega Evolution, the turn would play out like Tyranitar switches in, Sand gets set up, Charizard Mega Evolves, Sun overwrites Sand, Charizard blows up your team, you shake hands, and then you go build your own Charizard team. Charizard Y's primary attack was Heat Wave, which did huge chunks of damage to both its foes at the same time. But many Charizard would run Overheat or Fire Blast in addition to Heat Wave in order to threaten one-hit KOs on a single target. For rock and water type Pokemon who would otherwise resist its fire moves, Charizard Y often ran Solar Beam, which didn't even have to take a charging turn in the sun, making it even harder to deal with defensively. Some even ran Hidden Power Ice, that's Boomer Terra Blast for you new kids, to deal with pesky Landorus Therian. Add on to these great offensive options the amazing supportive move Tailwind, and you can probably see why Charizard Y was such a problem for so many years. It's worth noting that Torkoal pretty much was never considered seriously competitively until after Mega Charizard Y was out of the picture. While there are some other good fire types like Volcarona, Colossal, and Rotom Heat, none of them saw enough success to justify putting them on the honorable mentions list. But I still like them, so I'm going to mention them here. Before we get to the big three, however, I want to talk about two new Pokemon as of Scarlet and Violet. Neither of these Pokemon have been around for even a full season yet, so it's way too soon to consider them for the Giftotes, but based on how these next few years go, I think they could definitely earn a spot somewhere on this list. Starting with Chi-Yu. One of the 4 treasures of Ruin, Chi-Yu's unbelievable ability, Beads of Ruin, makes it not only one of the most threatening fire types ever, but one of the most threatening special attackers of all time. Its access to great offensive typing of Dark and Fire, plus its great special attack stat, means there's almost no Pokemon that can switch into it, especially if it's holding a boosting item like Choice Specs. Chi-Yu is flexible in the item that it holds. Scarf and Specs are 2 more popular items, but Focus Sash and Safety Goggles have seen success as well. It's a bit of a glass cannon, but players have had a lot of success with it this season despite that, whether through bulking it up through a defensive item or EV spread, or by positioning it properly to make sure it can't be taken out before attacking. Because its ability is so unique, I'm not convinced it's been fully figured out yet, so we'll have to see how it performs in these coming years to determine if it belongs on our list. The other honorable mention for the honorable mention list is Ogerpon Hearthflame. Game Freak's newest monstrosity has only been out for a few months, but it's already looking like it'll end up on our list sooner or later. Its fire and grass typing has a lot of benefits, but its real strength has to do with its move pool and abilities. I've already made a full video talking about how broken Ogerpon is, so you can check that out if you want to get the full picture. For now, we'll just have to wait and see if it lives up to the hype, which means it's time to talk about 3 of the best fire type Pokemon ever made. In my opinion, every single one of these Pokemon you could argue as being the best fire type ever made. So rather than rank them as 3, 2, 1, I'm instead going to go through each of them and then tell you which one I think is best at the very end. Starting with Gigantamax Charizard. While it is the only Pokemon on our list that was only legal for 1 generation, its presence as a Dynamax Pokemon was so major that it absolutely deserves its spot. Gigantamax Charizard was arguably the best Gigantamax and maybe even the best Dynamax Pokemon in all of Sword and Shield. Its special Gigantamax move Gmax Wildfire was probably one of the most broken moves ever designed. If you hit an opponent a single time with this attack, even if you hit them through Protect, both of your opponent's Pokemon would lose 1/6 of their HP unless they were Fire type. Losing that much HP on both of your Pokemon is a massive deal, made much more significant because this effect lasted for 4 turns. In other words, if your opponent took full damage from the effect every turn, this was the equivalent of dealing 1/3 of your opponent's total team-wide HP as a passive effect of landing a single attack. That's not even factoring in Gigantamax Charizard's access to Blast Burn, allowing Gmax Wildfire to be one of the single strongest max moves in the game. Dynamax moves scaled off the base damage of the original move they were using, and Blast Burn was one of very, very few moves that gives Gigantamax Wildfire a base power of 150 compared to the more usual 130. To make things even more overwhelming, Charizard's solar power ability made it nearly impossible to deal with. This ability powers up all of Charizard's special attacks if Sun is active, at the cost of some of Charizard's HP every single turn. This is in addition to the Sun powering up all fire type moves on its own. Gigantamax Charizard with solar power with a life orb in the Sun could one-hit KO nearly every non-Dynamax Pokemon in the format. And even if they managed to survive, it was very likely that they'd faint to the Gmax Wildfire passive damage. On top of its immense damage output, Gmax Charizard was able to be surprisingly bulky. Dynamax doubling the HP pool of a Pokemon allowed the normally frail Charizard to have surprising staying power. Some players opted to run defensive items such as Charty Berry to make Charizard even harder to remove. And by the time the World Championships rolled around, many players were even using the weakness policy item and training their Charizard heavily in bulk. The idea was that if you wanted to get rid of Charizard, you had to hit it with a super effective move, but doing so would then activate the weakness policy and give you virtually no chance to survive a hit. And all of this still isn't the full picture. Unlike Mega Charizard Y, Gigantamax Charizard was able to make excellent use of its flying typing. Special attacking flying types typically struggle due to not having a reliable flying type special attack. Air Slash is a really weak move, and Hurricane's accuracy makes it really inconsistent. Max Airstream, on the other hand, has no such drawback. Not only does it provide a powerful 100% accurate flying type move, it also gives Charizard and its partner a speed boost every time it connects. Max Airstream was one of the most reliable forms of speed control in Sword and Shield, and Gigantamax Charizard was one of the premier users. If your opponent somehow managed to survive the onslaught from Gigantamax Charizard for the 3 turns required to stall out Dynamax, they still weren't out of the woods. Because Blast Burn is the same power as that powered up T-Max Wildfire, the Sun boosted Baby Charizard hits just as hard as its giant counterpart. So many games were lost by players who barely survived Gigantamax, only to fall to Charizard nonetheless. Gigantamax Charizard was so strong that it warped the entire format around it, and had some of the most innovation out of any Dynamax Pokemon in Sword and Shield, and won countless tournaments despite being on literally every competitive player's radar. For its raw power, its flexibility, and its complete dominance over the competitive scene, it is a top contender for the best fire-type Pokemon of all time. Remember earlier how I mentioned how the best fire-type Pokemon aren't forced to all be either offensive or defensive? Well, while Charizard is a fire-type best suited for offense, Incineroar is the opposite. One of the most infamous villains of competitive Pokemon, Incineroar is arguably the best support Pokemon of all time. Its incredible defensive typing, phenomenal base stats, broken ability, and completely decked out move pool make it a versatile Pokemon that can fit on nearly every team and provide a ton of value. The thing that makes Incineroar the most broken is its ability. Intimidate is one of the best abilities in the game, as every time the user switches in, both opponents have their attack lowered by 1 stage. On a Pokemon as bulky as Incineroar that is often switching in 3 or 4 times in one game, that is a ton of value provided. Incineroar's typing of Fire and Dark leaves it with only 4 weaknesses in exchange for 6 resistances and an immunity. If you combine these great defensive relationships with absolutely phenomenal base stats, you have a Pokemon that is very difficult to take down. It also helps that 3 of Incineroar's weaknesses are types that tend to have primarily physical users, which means that they're weakened whenever Incineroar switches in, reducing the amount of damage most super effective hits will do. Incineroar's move pool only adds to the horror. It learns the move Fake Out, one of the best supporting moves in the game that prevents an opponent from attacking, but only works the turn Incineroar switches in. This means there's a ton of incentive for Incineroar to switch in and out, as switching in gives both Intimidate and Fake Out pressure. Most good Fake Out users are able to use the move twice per game at most, but like I said earlier, Incineroar can offer the value of this move as often as 3, 4, or 5 times per battle most of the time. Now, I just mentioned that Incineroar is incentivized to switch both in and out, which might seem strange. How can a Pokemon be incentivized to switch out? Well, it has to do with more moves that Incineroar has. U-Turn in Generation 7 and Parting Shot afterwards. These moves cause the user to switch, with U-Turn doing a bit of damage and Parting Shot lowering both the attack and special attack of the target beforehand. The important thing here is that these manual switching moves not only allow Incineroar to switch out and have a secondary effect, but they also allow something else to switch in. And because these are attacks, they happen when Incineroar, who is relatively slow, moves. Compared to switching out Incineroar directly, which happens at the beginning of the turn, these moves allow Incineroar to stay in, take a hit from the opponent, and then switch out, allowing your likely frailer Pokemon that was in the back to switch in unscathed. Like I mentioned, Incineroar used to have to use U-Turn to do this, but for some reason received a buff in the form of Parting Shot as of Sword and Shield. Parting Shot's mostly agreed upon as better than U-Turn unless you're using Assault Vest. Incineroar's access to good Fire and Dark type moves means that even though it's a defensive Pokemon, you absolutely cannot ignore it. It'll normally run Flare Blitz as its main fire type attack for similar reasons that we mentioned with Arcanine, but its dark attacks allow it to provide a lot of support. Knockoff removes items from opponents, Throat Chop stops sound-based moves like other Parting Shots, and Snarl can be used to lower both opponents' special attack stats, not to mention Darkest Lariat, which ignores defense boost. Between Flare Blitz damage output and the utility these dark type attacks provide, Incineroar is able to contribute to battle offensively as well as defensively. Incineroar works with a multitude of defensive items. We've seen Citrus and Figgy Berry for recovery, safety goggles for anti-powder moves, resist berries like Chopal, Shuka, and Pasho for help against its weaknesses, and Assault Vest for more general bulk, just to name a few. Incineroar's tools are so generally useful and versatile that it is truly the best support Pokemon that we've ever seen. It can fit on every team, and it's extremely difficult to have consistent counterplay to. There have been formats where Incineroar is on over 80% of teams, even at the top level at the World Championship, and it has won the World Championships every single year it's been legal since gaining access to Intimidate. Talking about the best fire types without mentioning Incineroar would be like talking to WolfeyVGC without him mentioning that he won the World Championships and that you should to his YouTube channel and Patreon. Which brings us to the last of our big three fire types. A Pokemon that, just like WolfeyVGC, won the World Championships. I'm talking about Primal Groudon, the fire and ground type Pokemon that was introduced in Omega Ruby. To say this guy was strong would be a massive understatement. The first time it became legal, it was a core member of the Big Six team I mentioned earlier. Paired with Xerneas, the competitive scene saw arguably the most powerful duo of Pokemon it has seen maybe ever. The thing about Primal Groudon is that it's somewhere between Gigantamax Charizard and Incineroar. It's very powerful, though not quite as powerful as Charizard, and very hard to get off the field, though not quite as tanky as Incineroar. It's basically the perfect, well-balanced fire type. To understand what makes Primal Groudon so broken, we have to start by talking about its ability. Desolate Land sets up a special type of strong sunlight. Fire type moves still get boosted by 50%, and Chlorophyll Pokemon still work, but if any water move is used while Desolate Land is active, the move fails. Unlike normal harsh sunlight, Desolate Land does not expire after 5 turns. It instead ends after Primal Groudon leaves the field. And very importantly, normal weather conditions cannot be used to overwrite Desolate Land. So Abomasnow, Politoed, Pelipper, Tyranitar, they all don't work. The only way to overwrite it is with either Primal Kyogre's Primordial Sea or Mega Rayquaza's Delta Stream. Primal Groudon has a quadruple weakness to water and a normal weakness to ground. In other words, the only type it's weak to under Desolate Land is ground. Even better, this combination features 5 resistances and an immunity. Combining these relationships with Primal Groudon's considerable physical bulk made for a Pokemon extremely difficult to get off the field. Primal Groudon was also given an absurd new signature move called Precipice Blades. It's stronger than Earthquake without the drawback of hitting your partner. It does suffer from imperfect accuracy, but this didn't faze competitive players as they rushed to put Primal Groudon on their teams. With its new fire typing, Primal Groudon was able to add a new dimension to its offense that baby ground-only Groudon previously lacked. Initially, this took the form of Fire Punch, but players soon began experimenting with a mix set with Primal Groudon, running speed control and eruption and earth power. Getting hit by a full power Primal Groudon eruption was often enough to lose the game on the spot thanks to how powerful the move is in Sun. With its incredible offensive moves, unbreakable defensive typing, and unholy base stats, Primal Groudon dominated nearly the entire competitive season when it was introduced in 2016, and very nearly won the World Championships, though it was stopped at the finish line by a certain dashing young man. Not to be deterred, Primal Groudon returned in 2019 paired with the newly introduced Lunala and won the World Championship, earning its spot as strongest in the world. Primal Groudon's introduction in any format completely warps the game around it. Teams need to be built with multiple answers to it, specifically in mind from the get-go. Hidden Power Water plus Rayquaza or Kyogre was considered an extremely viable strategy, so much so that the team that got second at the 2016 World Championships had 2 Hidden Power Water users. If it weren't for Kyogre and Rayquaza, Primal Groudon would have been an unstoppable force, and even with them around, players could only prevent it from winning 1 World Championship. For its bulk, power, and sheer strength, Primal Groudon is undoubtedly one of the best fire type Pokemon of all time. So now you know which fire types are in contention for the top spot. But before I tell you which one I think is best, I want to know what you all think. Leave a comment with which fire type you think is strongest and why. I'll make sure to read all of them. Now, you waited long enough. The best fire type Pokemon of all time is Incineroar. There's really no sugarcoating this one. You could probably make the case that Incineroar is the best Pokemon of all time, period. It was a tough choice between these three, but in the end, the fact that Incineroar has won all 3 of the world championships it's been legal for, compared to 1 out of 2 for Groudon and 0 out of 1 for Gigantamax Charizard, plays a role in my decision. On top of that, neither Gigantamax Charizard nor Primal Groudon's usage ever reached the peaks that Incineroar has, and that's in large part because of its flexibility. Gigantamax Charizard really needs to Dynamax to be strongest, and Primal Groudon takes one of a team's 2 restricted slots. Incineroar could be put on any team with any Pokemon and help them shine, and in the end, that was the deciding factor that made me choose it as #1 of all time. I really do think that any 3 of these Pokemon could have won it though, so if you think it should have been Charizard or Groudon, that's fine too. Oh, and in case you want to know my thoughts on the worst fire type Pokemon of all time, it's Blacephalon. I really hate clowns.